What's up guys, it's Will back again, and today's review is Nymphomaniac Parts I and II. This film was first requested to me by Noir Detective on my Lolita review that I released back on the 18th of July. So just a forewarning, this two-part movie and subsequently this review is not meant for all ages. I'm going to try to use as few clips and photos as possible to illustrate my points, but this movie is about a sex maniac. So I'm just giving you a fair warning that this video will contain discussion of content that might shock or offend. Just a heads up. Okay, so Nymphomaniac is a 2014 drama art film that was directed by Lars Von Trier and primarily follows a nymphomaniac by the name of Joe, who's actually played by two different actresses to suggest a passage of time. Young Joe is played by Stacy Martin and old Joe is played by Charlotte Gainsbourg. Joe's story of nymphomania is primarily told to Stellan Skarsgard's character Seligman, a middle-aged man who has provided Joe a safe place to stay for the night after he finds her on the streets. She explains to Seligman that she's a bad person, and eventually she's like, screw it, I'll tell you my whole life story and provide you examples of how shitty of a person I am. And the rest of the film is spent watching Joe and listening to her narration of her own life story and odd sexual experiences from the past, while also going back to present time where Joe and Seligman attempt to make sense of it all. Okay, so it totally makes sense that Noir Detective requested this two-part movie on my Lolita review, because I'm guessing he was trying to top how messed up that film was by giving me an even crazier one to review, because this film is absolutely insane and I have no idea how it's on Netflix's streaming service right now. I mean, I guess you couldn't make a film about a nymphomaniac without having some over-the-top visuals to really drive the point home, but this film attempts to take realism to a whole nother level. I mean, when you watch this, you're gonna feel like you're watching a more artsy version of a porno with a 4-hour backstory. Joe has a crazy amount of sexual encounters, and Lars Von Trier did not pull any punches whatsoever. He literally shows you everything, and I mean everything. And I've seen some crazy shit in movies before, but I don't think I've ever seen anything this crazy. I was literally sitting there in shock and laughing out loud because I was like, what the fuck am I watching right now? So thanks for that, Noir Detective. So as I said before, this movie is in two parts. Part 1 primarily accounts the younger life of Joe, where Stacy Martin does most of the heavy lifting. In Part 2, we pick up with Charlotte Gainsbourg as older Joe, and Stacy Martin is barely in it, if at all. I definitely prefer Part 1 over Part 2 because I just felt like Part 1 had much more substance to it. A lot of Part 2 either feels repetitive, like it's retelling the same story as Part 1, or a little heavy-handed. But I will say that although I prefer Part 1 over Part 2, both of them can get a little too ridiculous for my taste. It's hard to say what Lars Von Trier was actually trying to accomplish with these films, but I think a lot of what makes the content interesting is how real a decent amount of it feels. But there's several scenes that just feel so over the top that it sucked me out of the story and had me sort of cringing at how silly it all was. There's one scene with Thurman in particular that stood out to me as a shining example of how ridiculous and over the top these two films can get. Thurman acted her role fine, but the scenes themselves just come across as very silly and sort of out of place in a movie that's mostly pretty dark. But I will say that overall, these are two very, very well acted films. I gotta give credit where credit is due, because the situations that these actors and actresses immerse themselves into so effortlessly was pretty impressive. I thought both young Joe, played by Stacy Martin, and old Joe, played by Charlotte Gainsbourg, were both really well acted in their own respective ways. I will say though that sometimes it was pretty difficult to see how these two were even the same person. They don't really look alike at all, and they don't really act the same way either. I get that people mature, but this transition between the two actresses didn't seem very fluid to me. So again, very well acted individually, but the performances felt too separate for lack of a better word, and this threw me off a bit. I also really enjoyed Stellan Skarsgard's performance because he acts as sort of the slight bit of glimmering hope that these films contain. He constantly tries to convince Joe that she's not a bad person and that there is still hope in this world. He did a great job overall. Shia LaBeouf is also in this movie as Jerome, who's one of Joe's love interests, probably the main one, and he actually does a good job in limited screen time. His character is a pretty big jerk, but every character does some questionable things in these films. But Shia LaBeouf did a good job, and I was impressed by his work in this one. Okay, so I want to talk about the editing. I understand Lars Von Trier was trying to be artsy and unique and all that good stuff, but these are two very unevenly edited films. Sometimes everything flows really nicely and fluidly, and other times things are just randomly in black and white, or there are continuity errors that seem like they're there on purpose, and other similar things that are just very, very jarring. This might not bug some of you because you might argue that it's art and freedom of expression, but for me personally, I think that breaking the rules of editing and filmmaking in general doesn't usually work here. The cinematography, however, was something I did enjoy. I as a whole thought the film was shot pretty nicely. There's a lot of really nicely composed wide shots as well as tight shots that looked really nice. And let me just clarify, I'm not talking about the sex scenes, I'm talking about all the non-sex scenes. Just another reminder that these films have a ton of live sex scenes that are actually real, I believe, and you see genitalia and everything else, so if you want to watch this one, just prepare yourself. And one last con for me was the ending. This was a total slap in the face type of ending because it completely betrays everything about who the characters are up until that point. I was actually looking back on the 3+ hours I spent watching these two films somewhat fondly, and then when the end was creeping up, I was like, okay, it all has a purpose and I get it now. And then out of left field, nope, I was so furious when the credits rolled, the ending was just the worst. But before we wrap up, I want to throw one more thing out there that I did like about these two films, and that's the pacing. While I do think there was a decent amount of material that could have been left on the cutting room floor and thus brought the run times down, I do think that the story was told by Joe in a way that was entertaining and decently paced at the very least. But overall, I do think that Nymphomaniac Parts I and II have their moments, but they are chock full of flaws as well. I did think they had some nice acting performances, some well executed cinematography, and decent pacing. Sadly, I also felt the story was way too over the top at times, the editing was pretty choppy, the two versions of Joe felt like entirely different people, and the ending was awful. I'm going to give Nymphomaniac Parts I and II a combined score of 5.5 out of 10 and generally recommend you pass on this one unless you love Lars Von Trier or you're just a huge fan of unique art films like this in general. So did you guys see Nymphomaniac Parts I and II yet? What did you think of it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if not, let me know whether you'd be interested in watching these films or not. And as always, if you like this video, click that like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for much more content like this. Thanks again to Noir Detective for the request and expanding my horizons. Keep them coming, everyone. That's all for now though. This is WillFoxification signing off. See you in the next review.